Do you love books? Do you wish you could hear some insights straight from the author themselves? Join Sam Hankin, your host, as he interviews top-selling book authors and dives into interesting and unforgettable discussions here at the Avid Reader.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Stephen Harrison, author of Alexander the Great, Lives and Legacies. It's published by Reaction, and it'll be released this month. It is part of the Great Lives of the Ancient World series by Reaction. I love Reaction Press. The first two, I guess, or maybe Stephen's is first. Next are Archimedes and Plato. Stephen is lecturer of ancient history at Swansea University and historian of ancient Greece and the ancient Near East. His research focuses on the 6th to the 2nd centuries BCE, the era of the Persian Empire, and Alexander, and the Hellenistic kingdoms. And his next work will be published by Edinburgh, and it's about kings and empire, with a subtitle I won't get into. So let me start with 3 quotes. These quotes I would not normally begin an introduction with, but Stephen actually paves the way as he begins his narrative. First, history is a set of lies agreed upon. Napoleon said that. Second, history is nothing but a pack of cards we play on the dead. Voltaire said that. And all history is interpretation, which Nietzsche said that. So the first words of Stephen's book, it's kind of an invented italic epigraph, if you will, are a genius, a tyrant, a dreamer, a killer, a visionary, a maniac, Greek, not Greek, gay, not gay, a god, not a god, paranoid, destructive, delusional, drunk, virtuous, chivalrous, magnanimous, titanic. Great. So it's a rousing start to a book that certainly informs, provides a robust, three-dimensional portrait of a man whose name we all know, but whose life is a blur, at least for me, on most of these listeners and readers at best. Because now I have a much better idea. But what's so fascinating and invigorating about the work is that it's funny, it's self-referential, and strangely, it reminds us not only of Persia and Greece and history, it reminds us of us here and now in this somewhat strange world. So welcome, Stephen. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's really nice to be here. And, you know, the book came out 3 weeks ago in the UK. It's not out, it's coming out in the US soon. You're the sort of first person other than my dad who I've spoken to who I know has read it. So it's nice to know someone's read it. And, you know, what you say about it's very, very kind. And I think you kind of got to the heart of what I was trying to do with it, which is tell this story, but also bring a bit of personality to how it's written and to kind of, be self-referential and, you know, reflect different things. And yeah, thank you.
And you admit that some of it's going to be a problem because you might date yourself when you started talking about Palestine, and we both started thinking about what we thought about at the time you mentioned it. You know, maybe that won't last for 300 years, but it certainly struck me at the moment.
I mean, that passage, I was writing the book in January, February, a little bit of March 2024. And I was writing that passage about, so Alexander besieges Gaza as he's moving down through Phoenicia. And there's a brutal assault on the city. And then at the end of it, he catches the kind of Persian commander of the town, and he ties him to his chariot and drags him around the city, allegedly. It's kind of in imitation of what Achilles had done to Hector in the Trojan War. And I was writing about that passage, and I genuinely I wrote something, and then the next day I went back and I read the paragraph I'd written the previous day to carry on writing. And I read it and I looked at it and went, is that true or not? And I just felt like I had been exaggerating a little bit. And it kind of struck me that just with what I was seeing in the news and what was the imagery of the world around me, maybe some of this was affecting the way that I was writing. And then I had a discussion with my editor, who, you know, Vivian, who was brilliant, about where to draw the line between bringing in some of this material, because there is that danger that it dates it a little bit, and in 10 years or 50 years or 300 years, people don't understand what I'm saying. But from my perspective as a historian, the earliest source we have about Alexander is written over 300 years after he dies, right? And I wish that those Roman authors were explaining what was at the forefront of their mind, because it would help you analyze the sources that they produced, you know?
Yeah.
So that's I think where it's coming from.
Yeah, I know. There's this time machine that sometimes we create in our minds, and it's as if time doesn't exist. It's almost as if it's a warp because you can butt up what
Mm.
happened 3,000 years ago with what's happening now, and doesn't time doesn't intervene and get in the way.
Yeah.
And I wanted to mention first, since we're talking about humor, is in your lovely dedication to your grandparents, you say one of them taught you to have a twinkle in your eye and tongue in cheek, and you say you might catch a hint of it. You presage it in your dedication. Maybe some people don't see it, but I certainly did, and I certainly felt it. And you said you never imagined you would write the book. You say the
Yeah.
bare facts elude us. You just mentioned that, I was thinking about, well, we have, and I'll get these names mispronounced, Callisthenes, Ptolemy,
Yeah.
Aristobulus, who were contemporaries and who gave us something. But then you have Plutarch, which would be like, and then you talk about different narratives and battle scenes. It would be like me writing what Shakespeare had for lunch before he went to the Globe to watch a production of Julius Caesar.
Exactly. The example I give to people, because I think it's one that resonates, is to say, imagine if in 2000 years, the only information we had about Henry VIII was written today. That's the bit that kind of captures it for me, because that's the same time period. Think about how different the world is today to what it was, as you say, with what Shakespeare was having for lunch, and the worldview of the people who are writing. It's so different. So I think, yeah, that source problem underpins everything that you can say about Alexander, and I think it changes. For me, it changes the kinds of history that you can write about him because you can't prove that much, right? And so that
Yeah.
means I think you've got to reflect on it and you've got to have a slightly different attitude to what you're trying to accomplish. And you mentioned that line about doing things with a tongue in cheek and stuff. And that's, I think you're picking up there about a line about battle narratives where I say that I hate battle narratives. And because I tried writing a battle narrative and I looked at it and I just thought this is rubbish. And I kind of reflected on it. It's because, I've been teaching Alexander in a university for 10 years. And I was kind of thinking, I'm doing all of the things that when I go into the classroom, I tell my students not to do. Why am I doing it? Well, it's because the genre of writing ancient history kind of conditions us to expect that this is the kind of battle narrative. This is what it should look like. And I wanted to challenge that a little bit. And then I read it and I kind of thought, oh, it just looks a little bit boring if I don't do this. So I've got to play with this a little bit. And so I will do it, but I'm going to tell the reader that I'm doing it in a kind of performative way, in a tongue-in-cheek way. And hopefully that kind of comes across.
Well, there were two spots that came out, and one of them was hilarious. One was the idea of Alexander looking out over the battlefield at his cavalry, 500 yards away, and taking a look at him and deciding what to do. And you're saying, no, there's all this dust and it's 500 yards away. He can't possibly see it. And then someone coming up and saving Alexander's life by slicing off the arm of the assailant. And, you don't, no, it's like writing about a battle in Vietnam. You don't know. But the funniest thing, there was this one paragraph that was really exciting. And it was like being at a movie and eating popcorn. And then at the end of it, you go, AI wrote it.
Yeah. And that was fun to do. And I think the next bit that I say is that, well, why have I got AI to write a battle narrative? And there's two things. And one is that I kind of wanted to be zeitgeisty. And I say in the introduction, this book is going to reflect the time that it is written. And at the minute, what are we all doing? We're experimenting with ChatGPT. We're trying to see what it can do and what it can't. So I wanted to try it. But also, like, I think that example shows us the limitations of what large language models are. They predict the next word based on the aggregation of loads of information that's been fed into them, right? And so you say, write a battle narrative, and they're going to churn out something that is like thousands that have been produced before and give you something that's kind of the average expectation. And I wanted to kind of do that, play with it, and then undercut it a little bit and kind of say, all right, well, we can move beyond it and try to think about the battles in a different way. Because the point you make about, oh, this image of Alexander kind of pushing troops around on a battlefield, commanding what's happening when he's in the middle of a fight, I think it comes almost, I mean, it's always been the way people have written about ancient history and about battles and stuff, it goes right back to the, people like Arrian, who are the sources for Alexander, were writing about Alexander like that. But I think in today's world, a lot of people come to somebody like Alexander from video games where you're in complete control of these battlefield kind of narratives and you can be the general and you can be in the thick of the fighting at the same time. I think it is important to point out what is the actual perspective of somebody there, particularly as well when, communication is so different on the ancient battlefield to what it is like today, where people genuinely can talk to each other a bit more.
Well, a good example would be the way everyone seems to spin it as Alexander at the forefront, driving through the lines, hacking away like Mel Gibson in when he's Wallace, or in The Patriot, and then Darius basically running away. But you also say that discretion is the better part of valor, and maybe running away is the best thing to do because then you live to fight another day, and also you're alive, so you still have troops that are loyal to you, and you're the figurehead. But Alexander is going through. But okay, so say Plutarch in Parallel Lives or his contemporary biographers. I mean, what do you think happened?
I think the difficulty with them is, I think Alexander's brought up in a world in which your own personal participation at the forefront of a battle is integral to what constitutes good kingship. His father, Philip II, walked with a limp because he'd been wounded. He lost an eye in a siege. So Alexander grows up in a military culture where kings are expected to participate on the battlefield. I think in the 150 years before Alexander comes to power, I think there's only like 3 or 4 Macedonian kings who die peacefully. They're either assassinated or they die in battle or whatever. So it's not a peaceful life being a king in Macedonia. So I think it's perfectly plausible that Alexander would be at the forefront, would be charging around, would be doing the hacking and the killing that we associate with him. Yeah. And equally on the Persian side, I think it's perfectly plausible that the Persians have a different concept of what the role of the king should be in battle. And, these kind of things are societal constructs, right? So I think it's plausible that the battles happen as they are described, but the challenge is twofold. First of all, we can't prove that. And when the authors are writing these accounts that heroize Alexander, inevitably that's what they focus on. And that goes right back to somebody like Callisthenes, who is Alexander's official kind of historian, who's writing one of the accounts that people are using. Ptolemy's kind of the same. But also they're only telling one part of the story, which is that, in these ancient battles, you've got to remember that these are men, heavily armored men standing in 50-degree heat for hours on end, basically just pushing a spear towards somebody else. And yeah, there'd be rotations of fresh men coming in. But part of what I wanted to do when I was talking about the battles, I guess, was to just remind people of the kind of ordinary soldiers and the vital role that they played and the skills, the experience that they were required to have to be successful on the battlefield.
There's so how was I going to say this? You mentioned Philip, and you mentioned communication between troops, countries, times. So we should go to the record as it exists, probably fairly accurately. From Philip on, when Philip dies, he crushes the revolt in Thebes. He moves on to Asia Minor, to southern Turkey, to Lebanon, to Egypt, to Iraq, to Afghanistan, to Babylon, where he dies. And it's always been, since I was a little kid, it's always been phenomenal because it's impossible for me to imagine. I mean, we landed on the moon in 1969, and now every moonlander tips over and doesn't give us any information. So we couldn't do this now. I mean, we could do it with a nuclear bomb, but we couldn't do what he did. He's basically a kid, and there's no communication between all the places in which he exerts his control over.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we have to do when we think about ancient empire is to think about what do we mean by control. Because actually, the Persian Empire that Alexander conquers is a really good example of it. It lasts for 2 centuries, but quite a lot of Persian rule is probably quite laissez-faire. And as long as people on the ground are paying their tribute annually and not rebelling, a lot of people are left to their own devices. And what the Persians were doing is trying to create relationships with local elites, and you create kind of a relationship with the local elite, which gives the member of the local elite a stake in the empire and a stake in the preservation of the empire, because then they get to keep their position, you know? And I think a lot of what Alexander is, and a lot of what's lost from the kind of Alexander story is how far, I guess, he is able to do that. And one of the, I guess, the interesting things about Alexander is because he dies so young. He dies when he comes back from India. He's probably at a point where I think he's starting to look to the future and think about how to consolidate his empire. But he dies before that has happened, and he doesn't have the kind of succession set up, and so the empire falls apart. So we don't really get a sense of how far he's turned kind of conquest, military conquest, into a long-term empire. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the other things that's interesting about him, that, you know, he goes through one valley in Afghanistan. He might have pacified that valley. Is the valley next one along from it pacified? Are they really showing allegiance to him, or are they just trying to wait until he's gone and then they'll, you know, carry on as they always were, you know?
And naming city after city Alexandria.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then having time to establish the library. I mean, difficult to it's difficult to wrap your head around how great he
Well,
was.
I think, you know, something like that, you know, you mentioned the library in the Alexandrias. I think we've got to remember that those are essentially inventions of the period after he dies. So Alexandria in Egypt is, yes, it's founded by, allegedly it's founded when Alexander is in Egypt in 333, 332. But then, you know, Alexander's dead within 10 years, and it's taken on by Ptolemy. And things like the library, which emerge in the Ptolemaic period, become cultural centers. But what the Ptolemies are doing, and what Ptolemy the First particularly is doing, is capitalizing on Alexander's name as a source of legitimacy for himself. So Ptolemy is one of the he's one of Alexander's best friends. He's one of Alexander's generals. He becomes the pharaoh of Egypt, the king of Egypt after Alexander's death, and he writes his history of Alexander, which is used by Arian, and so is at the root of one of the main traditions that comes down to us. He's writing that while he's trying to establish himself as the king. So he's using Alexander's name, and he's developing Alexandria. And of course, he steals Alexander's body and gets it ultimately buried in Alexandria. So he's trying to build on that personal connection with Alexander. So it gives him a stake in developing Alexandria into what it becomes, you know?
That reminds me too, I should mention that there's a cast of characters in the very beginning of the book that are explained, because otherwise you're talking about Ptolemy and Cleopatra and you're not quite sure.
Wow. My dad read it, and my dad read it, and he said it was much easier to read than I thought it would be, and particularly once I gave up on worrying about who was who, because it is that, you know, when I teach this stuff, it is the hard thing is people have very similar looking names, but I think in some sense it you know, I wouldn't, you know, people listening, don't worry too much about getting your head around who's who. There is the kind of introduction at the front that people can flick to for a reminder, but it doesn't really change the story, and it doesn't change the points that are being made. And I think that's the main thing, isn't it?
No, it reminds me a little bit of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. I mean, they're there, but the entire war and the conquest is going through in between their own little conversations. And I guess that's what we should concentrate on to at least a certain extent in this interview, is maybe a chronology of what I alluded to before, and starting with, you even question the very beginning of his career after his father died, and then move on from there.
Yeah, I think what was interesting about writing the book was I wanted to kind of tell different kinds of stories. I wanted to talk about different people beyond Alexander. I wanted to kind of talk about some of the regions that he conquered and his impact on there in the longer term. But I also wanted to think about things like the sources. And ultimately, I decided the best way to do it is just to tell the story of Alexander, but then to weave in these other episodes. So, you know, a lot of like narratives about Alexander will start with a description of the sources, where you say, oh, there are 5 sources from antiquity that give us this literary tradition, da da da. But I think what I wanted to do was just start with an example of the source problem, that's grounded in the kind of narrative. And so the example I picked is, Alexander Philip is killed in 336. Alexander comes to power, and then the following year he goes off on an expedition into the Balkans to kind of pacify the north of Macedonia. And while he's away, the city of Thebes rebels, or kind of rebels is a strong word, but it tries to kind of overthrow Macedonian influence, which Philip had established in the city. So Alexander marches up to Thebes and goes to kind of negotiate or attack or whatever, and his army's sitting outside the city. And then suddenly an attack starts. And there's two different versions of what happens. One is from Arrian, who says that a member of Alexander's army, a kind of local battalion commander, a guy called Perdiccas, starts an attack on his own initiative and gets into trouble. And Alexander has to send in the whole army to rescue him. And that's why Thebes was attacked and ultimately destroyed. The other account is from Diodorus, who says Alexander ordered the attack deliberately. And so, as a historian, when you're faced with those two different interpretations of what happened, you say, all right, which of these accounts is more reliable? And you say, all right, well, when's the source written? All right, they're both really late. So we want to know who is Arrian's source, who is Diodorus' source. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to get towards an eyewitness account, aren't you? You're trying to work out how close to these events can I get? And so with Arrian, you say, all right, Arrian's source is probably Ptolemy for this passage. Ptolemy was there. Ptolemy knows what happens. Great, we've got an eyewitness account. We should trust Arrian. Diodorus, we don't know who his source was. We don't know where it comes from. We can get rid of that. But then you come back to Arrian and you say, okay, Ptolemy was writing when he tries to become king of Egypt, so he might have a particular horse in the race. And in particular, the very first thing that happens is that Perdiccas, the guy who's launched this attack on Thebes allegedly on his own, Perdiccas has become the regent. He's tried to send Alexander's body back to Macedonia to be buried. Ptolemy has turned up, stolen the body, taken it to Egypt. Perdiccas brings an army into Egypt to try to remove Ptolemy from power and ends up being assassinated in an assassination Ptolemy probably orchestrates. So when we go back to Thebes and the account of Thebes, you say, all right, we've got this account of Thebes in which Perdiccas is to blame for something, which we know people in Greece didn't like. Perdiccas is blamed for it. We can trace it to an eyewitness, but the eyewitness had a very obvious motivation for making this up and blackening Perdiccas' reputation. So who do we believe there, But then you say, all right, well, maybe that's wrong. Let's believe Diodorus, but then we don't know who his source is at all. So it kind of is a nice way to open the book up and say, here are these different source traditions. Here are the different pros and cons of them. And this is the impact it has on how we actually write history of Alexander. Because with Thebes, we know that Thebes was destroyed. But if we're thinking about history and causation, we want to know why Thebes was destroyed. We can't put ourselves back to that very moment when the pivotal decision is made and stay with any clarity whether or not Alexander gave the orders for an assault.
And that's why Game of Thrones or Dune are so easy to understand, because they're explained to you exactly the way they happen. Even though in Game of Thrones, there's as many empires and kingdoms as there may be in Alexander's lifetime. But here's one that everyone seems to agree with, but I don't quite know why. So when he's conquering India and in what is now Punjab, his troops say, we don't want to go anymore. We don't want to do this anymore. Can we just go back? And he goes back. And I didn't really understand that. I mean, troops could say that at any time, but everyone seems to agree that he could have gone further. And unfortunately, his troops essentially mutinied, and he goes, okay, I'll just go back.
Yeah, so this is in the Hyphasis River. They've been fighting in India for ages, and then the troops, he says, we're going to cross the river, and the troops say, no, we're going to turn around. And again, this is where we get into really interesting ways in which we can think about how to construct an image of Alexander. Because on the one hand, you've got this idea of Alexander wants to go and conquer the world. And this is explained expressly in Arrian. So Arrian basically says, this is brilliant. Arrian says, I don't know what Alexander's intentions were, and it's not my place to guess. But I think he would have gone on vying with himself in the absence of any other rival until basically he's conquered the world. He wouldn't have stopped had he added Europe to Asia and the British Isles to Europe. He just said he would have kept going. So for him, that image is borne out by what happens on the Hyphasis, right? So his image of Alexander wanting to go on and on and on, only works if Alexander turned back because his men made him. Yeah.
Oh,
So that's kind of constructing an image of Alexander as this global conqueror. There are very legitimate reasons why the men might have wanted to turn back. This is monsoon season in India. They've been trudging on for ages. They were told at the start of the campaign, the whole point of this is we're going to go and conquer Persia. Well, Darius III has been dead for 5 years by this point. The Persian Empire has been captured, and they're kind of going, what's the point? Why are we here? And they're already potentially the richest people in the world, right? They want to, they've seen their friends die, they've been wounded, all of those things. So there's lots of reasons why the men might be wanting to go home. Then we can play a bit of devil's advocate though and go, why now? And also the thing that allegedly makes the mutiny is that Alexander's saying, "Oh, we're going to cross this river," and that they've been hearing reports that there are even more warlike tribes in the distance, and even more fearsome kings, and even more fearsome creatures. So you've got to remember that going to India was kind of a journey into the exotic for the Greeks and the Macedonians. So something like an elephant, which we take for granted now, is terrifying to Macedonians when they see it for the first time. This great mythical beast, right? And they're hearing there's reports of these even bigger elephants and things. And these rumors are going around the camp. And it's perfectly plausible that rumors like that would go around the camp and it would make them go, make them kind of, it's called a mutiny, but make them kind of upset or reticent to go on. But the other side of this is Alexander must have known he couldn't conquer the world. He must have known. Because, you think about you quoted Napoleon earlier on, take another Napoleon quote or a purported quote, an army marches on its stomach, right? Alexander's supply lines to Macedonia are already the width of a continent. There's no point going further and further and further into the unknown, particularly bearing in mind that every time he conquers somewhere, he's going to have to leave a garrison to keep control of it. So his troops are already being diluted. So part of me, when I'm in a playful or a cynical mood, part of me sometimes wonders, is actually Alexander feeding these rumors? Does he want the troops to mutiny so that he's got an excuse to turn around? Because he can't turn around of his own volition and keep the image of the world conquering hero going, but he can turn around if people demand to. And the other kind of important thing about that story is the troops mutiny and say, we want to go home. And he says, no, we're crossing the river. And he goes back into his tent and he shuts his tent for a couple of days and he won't speak to anyone. And this is something he's done in previous occasions and done on previous as a negotiation tool, right? But then on the third day, he comes out and he does the sacrifices to cross the river. And then the sacrifices are full of bad omens. And so he says, right, we'll go home now. And what he's doing there is he's controlling the narrative. He's not saying we're going home because the troops want us to go home. He's saying we're going home because the gods are telling me not to cross this river. So he's controlling the narrative in an interesting way, I think.
it's a good story. But see, when I first read the title and the subtitle, Lives and Legacies, I'm going, well, I don't understand that. It's just one man and one legacy. And then in italics, the very first thing I read is that he's a dreamer, he's a killer, he's gay or not gay. All these questions that are counterpoint to one another. And that's how you begin the book. So as we go in, I'm thinking, I'm reading almost a novel because we're talking about interpretation based on sources that actually are not original in the first place. It's a bunch of Byzantine monks writing down something that Plutarch said. So it's removed. So for a young reader, for me, what's the basic idea? The basic idea is not to learn, like we're joking about what he had for lunch, or whether he had a horse, Bucephalus, who was his horse. I don't know. And plus you put beautiful artwork and maps throughout the book that readers will love of his horse. So okay, we don't take away from it, by your words and the manner in which you wrote the book, that this is what happened and this is who he was. So then what is it we're supposed to take away? We can't take the truth.
Yeah, I think there's two things that I was getting at. One of which I set out from the start to do, and one of which I discovered along the way. The thing I set out to do from the start was to say the basic story of Alexander the Great is well known. So why write about it again? Well, and that's something that people have been saying, Arian was saying that. People have been saying that for hundreds of years. Why write another book about Alexander? Um, and my pitch to the reader is times have changed. And therefore, the questions that we have about the past are different to the questions that they had about the past 100 years ago. We're interested in different things. And so I wanted to write a book which brought to life different elements of Alexander's reign. So people who were forgotten, so kind of women, or particularly the agency of local people who were touched by Alexander's campaigns, wanted to bring that out. To think about the other people who fed into Alexander's reign, the men around him, the people in his court, and those kinds of things. So that was one of the pitches. And then I think the other thing that I think a reader can take away, and which I discovered while I was writing the book, is I started to ask myself, what's the point of a historian as I was writing the book? Because I guess there's two big influences on what we think of as history. And the first goes all the way back to Herodotus, writing his history of the Persian Wars in the 5th century BCE. And he opens up that book by saying, this is the display of the inquiry of Herodotus of Halicarnassus into the causes of the wars between the Greeks and the Persians. And that Greek word inquiry, the Greek for it is historia, which is where we get our English word history from. And so it's the idea that at the heart of what it means to be a historian is to inquire into the causes of something. And then another big influence on history is the 19th century German historian Leopold von Ranke, who talks about how historians should show history exactly as it was. And we're trying to kind of, show exactly how it was. And as I was writing the book, I kind of went, well, I can't show this exactly how it was because none of us can. And also, I can't explain why this stuff happened definitively because nobody can. So therefore, what's the point of doing history? And I think it became a little bit more, and you mentioned that parts of the book are quite reflective about what the kind of purpose of history is. And I guess what I wanted to do is to take the reader behind the curtain of historical research. Because I think when I read history books, and I think particularly when academic historians write for a non-academic audience, I think we quite often fall into just telling you stuff and saying, this is how it was, this is the story, this is it. And all of the research that we do kind of gets missed out of that stuff. And for me, it's the research, it's the debate that is interesting. It's explaining, why have I chosen to go with this version, not this version? And so a little bit of what I'm trying to do is bring to life the process of being a historian. And that's why I end the book in the way that I do, by just saying, that's my Alexander, what's yours? And I think there is probably space, particularly with Alexander, to say, there are these different versions. This is my view, but actually these other views are tenable too, and you can have a stake in this. And that was something that I felt was quite important.
Yeah, that's another thing about a good book, in addition to the things I've mentioned, is that when you close the covers on this book, in my case, the virtual cover, you're not done. I mean, like you said, you're kind of giving the reader, hey, okay, that's it for me. Now you figure out what you think happened. And I pondered that because it's like, okay, I'm as valuable as all these other people. I'm as good a resource as anybody else. I've been given the input. It's kind of like AI, but then there's humanity in it. So a little confusing, but then you go back to, who was the ancient guy who wrote the book and said, there's really no reason to write any other books because mine is obviously.
Yeah. And I've been writing a couple of things for kind of blog posts and stuff recently, and I've been opening by saying, Arian opens by saying this is a definitive account of history. I understand the dilemma of trying to say, why am I writing something different? But my solution is very different. And I think about I had in my mind with some of this. Did you ever read any of the Choose Your Own Adventure books?
Oh yeah.
When you get to the bottom of the page and it says, "Oh, if you want to follow the man in the hat, turn to page 55." And I think there's scope for kind of creativity in how we as historians communicate to the wider world. Because the thing that drew me to Alexander, so I did a history degree, and in my history degree, every term I did a different module, and I did 18th century British history, I did 20th century history, I did one module in the ancient world. And every week I had to write an essay, 2,000 words a week. And I did a module in ancient history. And what I loved about it was that in a week, I could read everything that there was. And so it meant that when I came to writing that essay, I felt like I had a right to an opinion because how could I argue with somebody who was a specialist in Nazi Germany, for instance, who'd spent 25 years working in German archives, looking at material that I didn't have access to? Whereas with the ancient world, what I loved about it was just, all right, I've read this stuff now. What do I think? And that's what led me to do my master's in classics, my PhD in classics, and to go down the ancient history route as a career. And I wanted to bring a little bit of that background and a little bit of that enthusiasm into the book. And yeah, say to the reader in places, the example, there's another good example with the sources are Alexander sets the Persian palace at Persepolis on fire. And there are two different accounts. One is that it's a very deliberate decision and it's going to be vengeance for the Persians having burnt down Greece. The other is that he got drunk and a prostitute suggested that he did it at a banquet. And again, you go, oh, Ptolemy is the source for the deliberate account. So that's probably true because the drunken prostitute story seems a bit exaggerated. But then you find out that the drunken prostitute in question, a woman called Thais, had a sexual relationship with Ptolemy. So Ptolemy had a very obvious motivation to suppress her role in events. Alexander allegedly regretted burning down the palace at Persepolis. Ptolemy's trying to set himself up as a king. He doesn't want to admit that he's associating with a woman who's got a history of leading kings astray, right? So he's got a motivation. So again, and that's where I think legitimately you can say to a reader then, you can choose which of these versions you want to believe. And actually, it can be a little bit of both, you know?
Who was the woman who, because you really spin a tale here and it was very cinematic, which I'm thinking, how can this be cinematic? The woman who mistook Alexander's compatriot for Alexander.
Oh, yeah, yeah, Sissy Gambus. So this is Darius III is the Persian king, his mother Sissy Gambus. And I'm so pleased that I was able to write this story into the book because I've been dying to write about this for ages. The story is that after the Battle of Issus, Alexander captures the Persian camp because Darius has fled. And in the Persian camp, he finds the Persian royal women. Darius has taken his family with him. So Sisygambus, the queen mother, is there. Darius's wife, Statira, is there. His daughter, also called Statira, I told you the names were confusing, is there. His son's there. There's another daughter. And then the Macedonians are having a banquet to celebrate their victory, and they hear crying from the Persian tent. So Alexander sends a messenger in to kind of calm the women down and tell them that Darius is not dead. And then the next day, Alexander goes in to visit the Persian women, and he's accompanied by Hephaestion, who's his best friend, possible lover. That's a whole different debate I won't get into now. But Sisygambus performs this gesture of proskynesis. And proskynesis, the Greek literally means to kiss towards, and it's this action of blowing a kiss. I'll do it on the webcam for the people on YouTube. It's kind of that gesture, right? But it's accompanied by a bow. And there are different versions of it. In some cases, it might have meant fully prostrating yourself, so lying down on the floor. And in the Persian court, this was a way of just showing you acknowledge the status of the king. Right. And it's part of Persian society too. So they come in and Sisygambus performs proskynesis to Hephaestion, not to Alexander. And the sources say it's because Hephaestion is taller than Alexander, so she thinks that he must be the king, right? And Alexander then and she's then really embarrassed, and Alexander's kind of like, don't worry, like Hephaestion is an Alexander too. And what the stories are doing there really is they are playing on the relationship between Alexander and Hephaestion. And they are making it out that Hephaestion is kind of Alexander's alter ego, and it's bound up in the romantic tales about those two men, right? But what is interesting for me and what I liked playing with in the book is, first of all, that story is not true. I don't think that story is true. I think it's invented later, but it makes us ask, let's pretend for a moment it is true, and instead of it being a mistake, let's pretend that it's deliberate. How does that change the way we see that story? Imagine Sisygambus deliberately undermining Alexander's authority by bowing to Hephaestion. What happens if then when the men walk out of the room, she lets slip that with whatever the kind of Persian equivalent of a knowing wink is. She let slip that it was deliberate, and suddenly this kind of moment of everyday resistance, and the women who were involved in this, including, I guess, the courtiers and the servants or the enslaved people in her court, they're all the kind of keepers of a secret. And it's this kind of the start of their captivity, but maybe the seeds of resistance. And I'm playing with the idea there. I'm playing with the idea that I don't believe this happens, but it gets to the heart of the possibilities. And that gesture of proskynesis was a really important one at the Persian court. And it does become a part of Alexander's court, and there's tension around that. So that story and telling the story the way that I did lets you play around with ideas. And I think, you know, the creativity of history is a creative thing, is a really important aspect of the discipline that I think gets overlooked. And, you know, you mentioned AI before, and we've talked a bit about that. Like, this is the kind of human creativity that is different and it is unique to humans. And, you know, you mentioned the cinematic element. I actually did make a short film about that scene. If listeners want to look up, it's called Sissy Gambus, and it's on the Swansea Uni Ancient Worlds YouTube channel somewhere. But yeah, we can link to it.
Well, the funny thing is that it's like you paint this idea of, I can just see, you know, like him being embarrassed and Alexander putting his arm on his shoulder and she being embarrassed. And then I think of me going to a party and greeting the wrong person as the hostess. And so it all becomes very, very personal. And you can see the expressions on their face. But once again, one, that's not necessary. Well, it's not what happened. And two, you don't even believe it. So as we're talking, first of all, one thing that's interesting, I keep smiling. Why am I smiling? I have no idea, but I find it entertaining, amusing. I have no idea why and you did too. And then I'm thinking, okay, wait, maybe this is like the Spider-Verse. Maybe this is the simulation and all these possibilities. Maybe that's the way everything is that all those possibilities.
And I think it is worth, and I think it is worth saying to people listening, there are parts in the book where I say, this is what I think happened. And I am definitive about it because I think we can be. I just think that when we write history, and as historians, particularly when we talk to wider audiences, I just think we need to be better at saying, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, this is what we might know, this is what we definitely don't know. And that story about Sissy Gambus, yeah, I'm playing with the ideas, but it's exploring what's possible in the social context of the time, because we don't have the evidence to say, we don't have the evidence of when the proskynesis was first performed to Alexander. But I think it would have been happening from the very moment he lands in Asia, because that was the way in which Persians recognized the authority of the king. So as soon as a leading Persian surrenders to Alexander, they would have performed that gesture, first of all, to acknowledge their surrender and to demonstrate a change of allegiance, but also because Alexander would want them to do that to encourage other people. And then, you know, proskynesis becomes a massive issue 327-ish, because in the Greek world, it's potentially associated with actions you might perform as an aspect of worship. So when there's allegedly a debate at a banquet where it's proposed that Alexander kind of has it mooted that people should perform proskynesis to him, and people object to this on the grounds that it would be kind of blasphemous. That leads to the root of this story that Alexander wanted to be worshipped like a god, which is kind of mentioned in the introduction. I talk about in the book. But for me, kind of acknowledging that proskynesis story, acknowledging that proskynesis is part of the Persian world, even when I'm playing with the ideas, it makes a serious point, which is that proskynesis becomes an issue for Alexander because of Persians. Persians come into his court and they bring that culture, they bring that practice with them. So irrespective of what Alexander's thinking, irrespective of what he wants relative to the divine world, he's got to deal with the issues because Persians are doing it and have been doing it for pushing 10 years by the time it becomes an issue at the court, you know?
It's interesting that one thing that I know is true, and I can't really explain why. Well, yeah, I can. Rape, murder, pillage, slavery, mutilation. Those things are all true because that's what we do today. And if you look back, it's no different. And so those things that happened, one, it's very difficult to imagine or emphasize with that, because we wouldn't be able to live if we could feel other people's pain. But the pain that must have been caused by Alexander and his opponents was
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah.
And you can't deny that in the slightest.
I mean, some of the stories about, people in Persepolis going up to the roofs of their houses and throwing themselves to their death to escape what was happening, or locking themselves up in their houses and setting their houses alight and burning themselves to death and all of their possessions to escape from what the Macedonians were doing. And it was tricky kind of writing about some of that and working out how much I wanted to deal with that, because you have to deal with it. There's then the challenging line of, oh, well, attitudes in the ancient world were different, and of course that's to be expected. But then there are episodes in the book, particularly in India, where I think even the ancient authors are shocked at the scale of what's happening. The best example is in India, where Alexander splits his army up into kind of three different groups, and there's an advance force that kind of goes ahead of the main force, and then a kind of final force, a third force that follows a few days' march behind. And basically anyone who escapes the main force and goes forwards is caught by the advance force, and anyone who slips through the net is swept up behind them. And this is kind of a pretty systematic kind of annihilation. But the sources don't talk about that, and they aren't interested in that. And then we know this must have happened, but it's like how much can you write from this must have happened, when you don't have evidence to support the claims that you're making, And as you say, how far can you empathize with people? How far can you put yourself into those situations? And it's a situation that I found difficult. And so my way of dealing with that, I think, partly it is to acknowledge it, and I do acknowledge it, and I talk about it, and I include those examples. The other thing that I wanted to do with some of this is, I think quite often we look at the conquerors and the conquered, and we have those two perspectives. And we sort of divide people in imperialistic terms into the subaltern, or the people at the top, whatever it is. And there's a danger when we look at Alexander's campaign that we have the Macedonians, and often the Macedonians and the Greeks, and then the Persians. And by the Persians, we're lumping in Babylonians, Elamites, Medians, people from Bactria or Sogdiana, And so we're kind of making the story too simple. And it's the same is true with, how people experience conquest, and how because for some people, and I give some examples in the book, for some people, Alexander turning up was an opportunity for them to enrich themselves, or to get one over on their local rivals. And the best example in the book, I think, again, it's me playing with ideas, but this is a bit more grounded in historiography, in ancient evidence, is a woman called Apama. So Apama is born probably in the early 330s, don't know a precise date. Her father, Spitamenes, is one of the warlords in Afghanistan who is leading a kind of resistance movement against Alexander. He is connected to the Persian nobility. I'm not saying that he's necessarily a Persian, but he's part of the Persian administrative hierarchy. So she's born into a relatively, I would say like lower end elite. So she's part of it. She's born into an imperial apparatus. She's born into a family that's benefiting from imperialism. Then Alexander comes along. Her dad leads the resistance, and her dad gets killed. In one story, her mum kills her dad. And we can only imagine how shattering that would have been for this young woman. Her dad is dead. You lose the family position, and we don't know what happens to her. But then Alexander in 324 orchestrates these mass weddings at a place called Susa. He marries again into Darius's family, and then lots of his generals are married to Persian women or Asian women. And Apama appears in the record at this point, and she's married to Seleucus. And again, we can say, could she speak to Seleucus? Could she speak Greek? When did she find out about this? What had she been doing for the last 5 or 6 years? Where had she been? She'd been in captivity, all of those things. Probably quite a shocking moment. And we can write a narrative there in which she's a victim, clearly. But then, after Alexander's death, Seleucus becomes the kind of ruler of the biggest of the successor kingdoms. He rules the whole of Asia. His kingdom stretches from Turkey to India. And Apama is his queen, and there are inscriptions in which there are dedications put up to Apama to thank her for, paying for the construction of temples and stuff like that. So Apama becomes integral to the establishment of a different imperial dynasty. So it's really easy to think about, imperialism and conquest in terms of black and white. But I think Apama shows you some of the gray area. She's born into an imperial apparatus, it's completely overturned, and you think that she's lost everything. And then suddenly she becomes queen of the most powerful empire that there is. We don't know much about her, and I sort of speculate a bit in the book, and I kind of explain where the lines can be drawn. But it's quite a remarkable story, and it shows you the kind of grey areas that exist. And I wanted to do a little bit in the book to bring those grey areas to life.
The as we draw to a close here, there was one thing I wanted to mention. I mentioned the one thing about the horrors of war. The other thing that still holds true, and I know is true, is things like the phalanx and flanking maneuvers and the art of war. And those things, in my mind, had to be true. So briefly explain what the phalanx was and how long the spears were and how they decided when to flank, when to go through, when they saw a gap and they could take advantage of the gap, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, so the phalanx is the kind of core of Alexander's army. It's an infantry unit, and it's from the reign of Philip II, equipped with this long spear that's called the sarissa. And that gets a lot of attention in military history circles. And I'm not going to pretend to be a military historian. I can't tell you how long it is, because that's one of the things that there's a huge amount of academic debate about. I think what matters is that it was longer than the spears that were carried by infantry hoplites in the Greek world. So that gives you a tactical advantage on the battlefield. And I joke about this with my students, and I probably shouldn't, but I always joke and say, it just means they can stabby them from further away than they can be stabbed from. And that's the ethos of it. But the reason that it's significant is that the obvious thing is if I've got a spear that's longer than you, so I can reach you and you can't reach me, the obvious thing is for you to go away and get a longer spear and then come back and you can get me, right? So why don't other people copy it is, I guess, the question. But it comes down to the implications that as soon as you get a longer spear, you've got to use both hands to hold it. As soon as you've got to use both hands to hold it, you can't hold a shield. So you can't protect yourself. So you can have a small shield on one of your shoulders that you give you some protection, but you're going to be less protected than the Greek hoplite. What that means is you've then got to be in formation, because as soon as you're isolated, you're in trouble. It also means that you aren't very mobile, because if you've got a 13-foot spear in your hand and you want to change direction, if you don't coordinate that very well as a unit, you're knocking each other out and you're whacking each other as you're turning around. Yeah. So all of that takes coordination, and that takes training. And that means that you've got to have your men under arms for a long period of time. And that takes money. And this is, I think, where Philip II is so important, and why, I think in the last 25 years, there's been a little bit of a rehabilitation of Philip II as a historical figure, because he's just overlooked and surpassed by Alexander, but he creates the army that Alexander's able to use to such devastating effect, right? And what he essentially does is he conquers a region, exploits his natural resources, feeds that money back into the military, which lets him keep men under arms for longer, which lets him train people. And his contemporaries, so somebody like Demosthenes, a famous Attic orator, is complaining in the Athenian assembly that Philip can keep his men under arms the whole year. In Athens, they can't, because in Athens, they're citizen soldiers. Those men also have to work on the fields. They have to be in charge of making sure that the harvest gets done. So the campaigning season in Greece is quite short. So what you get is a kind of military and social revolution in Macedonia during the reign of Philip II that lets the phalanx become what it was. In terms of the tactics, I guess the point with the phalanx is you kind of pin the opposition down, and then the main strike weapon is the companion cavalry, which is the cavalry that Alexander leads in battle, and they're using that as a strike force that has its, it's the antecedent of things like tanks, which is it's quick, it's mobile, it's got devastating impact onto a unit. And if you can charge that, if you can create a gap and go through that gap, then you can have a devastating impact on the battlefield, I guess.
Yeah, and it's one of the things we inherit from the Greeks, from the Romans, is this idea, whether it's D-Day or the Battle of the Bulge or Midway, if you see a gap and you think you can get through that gap before it closes, then you take that advantage, and you have to be a really smart general to do it. Or if you see that you can flank their main force and get behind them and in front of them at the same time, in all likelihood, you're going to prevail. Those things I know to be true. And so it gives me kind of a feeling of comfort that I can honestly say, I'm pretty sure this happened. And I can be pretty sure I can imagine it happening.
Yeah, and I think the principles that you're talking about there work, but the other principles about training, the importance for men being equipped well, being well, that good morale, all of that stuff that you'd associate with leadership and generalship is as true now as it was
Well,
then.
you talked about Napoleon marching on army marches on a stomach. It's this, the supply chain. The supply chain is still just as valuable and important as it was, whether you're giving your soldiers spam or whether you're giving them ammunition. Without either, you're not going to succeed. So that's just as important as Apple getting chips from NVIDIA or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
So anyway, we could go on for a while, but I really enjoyed the book, and I'm looking forward, except you said, since it's academic, it's going to be boring, but I shouldn't say that. That book probably won't be in the bookstore, but what else do you have coming along? Or now that you said, I never thought I would write this book. Do you have another book that you never thought you would write that you're going to write?
Oh, I'd love to write another one because I really enjoyed writing this. Yeah, the kind of to explain I've got a more academic book that's coming out in September this year. That's kind of the product of my doctoral thesis, but it's been completely revamped and rewritten. So it'd be nice for that to come out, and then I can start thinking about next steps. Yeah, I really enjoyed Alexander. I'd like to do something that's perhaps foregrounding even more forgotten voices from Alexander's reign. But the other thing I'm interested in is kind of Alexander's later reception in. I get one thing I'm starting to do a little bit of work on is East India Company, so a much later period of history, but these were people who were going out into Iran and into Afghanistan, following in Alexander's footsteps and looking at what they were saying and writing about Alexander the Great and the reception of him in that period. So a couple of ideas.
That's great, because our bookstore, for whatever reason, attracts lots of customers who love history, and we have lots of people who work there that are really good devotees of historical research. So I'm looking forward to having this in the store. Another month or so it'll be out. This broadcast will be in the beginning of July, and the book will be out in the third week of July here in the States, and it's already out in the UK. So thanks so much.
I think people can pre-order it, can't they, if they want to?
If you go to Amazon, you can pre-order it and it'll be delivered the day it's released. But I definitely want to thank you for doing this. I had a great time, and I really enjoyed speaking to you about this.
Me too. Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of The Avid Reader. If you liked today's episode, check out more of our content on our channel.